Velkommen til Ræsstaten. Mit navn er Jonas Herby, og Ræsstaten det er podcasten, hvor du, sammen med mig og mine gæster, bliver klogere på, hvad regulering betyder for det danske samfund og den enkelte dansker. I dagens afsnit der er vi en svensker som gæst, og derfor så har vi aftalt, at vi snakker engelsk i stedet for dansk/svensk, for at lette kommunikationen lidt. So today's topic is, did Sweden start an experiment when the country, led by Anders Tegnell, decided not to lock down in the spring of 2020? And if so, how did the experiment turn out? That is the topic for today's conversation, where the Swedish journalist and author to the book Flocken, Johan Anderberg, joins us. Johan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Johan, can you start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
I'm a Swedish journalist. I've been working for almost 20 years now as a journalist, and I've written a couple of books before. But this book, Flocken, is by far my most read book, and it's about the Swedish pandemic strategy, pretty much.
And can you? What does Flocken mean?
It means the herd, which is kind of a play on both the concept of herd immunity, but also herd mentality, in that people tend to think the same way in certain situations. So
can you, before we get to your book and your opinions on the Swedish COVID policy, can you tell us a little about what is the status on COVID in Sweden today?
Well, the status is that it's spreading still, and the Swedish hospital system is kind of under a lot of strain still, but nowhere near the peaks of last year and early this year. But basically all the restrictions are gone since a month or two.
And what about testing? And I read in a newspaper that in Sweden you have to pay to get tested.
Yeah, they changed the recommendations just recently, which has been a small topic of debate. And if you have symptoms, you're not supposed to get tested if you're vaccinated. So, but overall, that's like one of the many things that have set Sweden apart, that we haven't undergone as many tests as the rest of the world. I for one, have only taken 2 tests, I think, during the whole. And the first one was when I went to Denmark this summer, and the second one was when I went to Iceland a couple of weeks ago.
Did you catch COVID at any
I don't think I've had COVID. I think I didn't have any antibodies before I got vaccinated, and and since I only took two tests, I don't know, but I haven't had any serious COVID, at least.
Okay. Yeah, just on the test, I can see. I'm just looking it up now, and in Denmark we test about 25 tests per 1,000 citizen, and in Denmark in Sweden it's closer to basically closer to 1. So we test about 20 times as much in Denmark as in Sweden.
Yeah.
And recently in Denmark we introduced the Corona Pass again in some places. So you have to show Corona Pass if you want to go to. I was in Lalandia and a water park this weekend, and we had to show a Corona Pass because of the rise in cases. Yeah. Do you know what is your feeling on the future Swedish policy? And maybe I should say we record on the 17th of November, so things can change quickly. But do you think you'll see restrictions again in Sweden?
It's a bit hard to say, but my bet is there won't be any more restrictions. Maybe a few changed recommendations if cases go up, but at least for the foreseeable future. There's an election coming up in less than a year, so maybe after that there will be some changes. But as of now, I don't really see that much changing, actually.
Okay, so you feel that if cases start rising in Sweden, you'll follow your strategy from 2020 and basically let it up.
Yeah,
let it be up to the individual.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because Sweden has chosen its own path and it's kind of continued into like the late innings here, because with the COVID passes, we haven't had any vaccine mandates or anything like that, and so this is just like the latest part of this pandemic, and that Sweden like chooses its own path pretty much.
So let's get back to your book and talk a little about the Swedish COVID strategy. I think most people know that the Swedish strategy differed from the rest of the Western world, but can you talk a little about both how it was different and how you perceive major differences in both in the regulation, but also in the way that the disease was communicated to the herd?
Yeah, well, so in my book, all the action is pretty much in the middle of March of 2020, when Sweden has a strategy that's pretty similar to a lot of country strategies. And it's pretty much like a textbook pandemic strategy. And then suddenly there's a report coming out from a university in London, Imperial College, where they predict 84,700 Swedish deaths and 500,000 British deaths and 2 million US deaths if nothing is done. And this report, along with like some Chinese lockdown policies and some other like notable, like almost internet sensations, like the hammer and the dance, this text about what the rest of the world should do. All those things turn the rest of the world into like a brand new strategy that has never been tested before. And the Swedes, they pretty much do what they thought they would do a couple of months ago if this happened. And it's kind of interesting how these few people just decide to go against the grain like that. And so that's like an important part of this story, that in a sense, it wasn't Sweden that chose to do this experiment. It was like the rest of the world, since nothing of this magnitude in terms of lockdown had been tried before.
No, I remember hearing Tegnell say that he was at a meeting about the strategy in Sweden, and they decided to follow the strategy that had always been the plan when the pandemic would eventually hit Sweden, and it came out from the meeting. Maybe it wasn't that, I mean, at the exact same moment, but he realized that everybody else was diverting from the strategy that they have been talking about for years. So one of the things I find a little impressive is that Tegnell doesn't like he's and his group, they stick to the strategy even though everybody else changes. So can you talk a little about why that happened?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think a lot of it is a personality thing, that like some people have no problem being alone in their views. You see that sometimes, you know, in other aspects of like other sciences, other, like, for instance, I'm a big fan of the books of Michael Lewis, and his entire authorship has been about finding these people that go against the grain, like the baseball coach in Moneyball, and the hedge fund guys in The Big Short, which probably a lot of the listeners have seen that movie. And like that, some people have this ability to do what, like, to not care about what other people are doing and like sticking to it. And that could also, of course, be a problem in other areas. And if things had turned out worse for Sweden, he probably would have been more blamed. But as we probably will talk about, the deaths haven't even been near to the predictions of
Yeah, but I remember in late March, early April in 2020, where I was starting to get interested, because when they locked down in Denmark, I was thinking that, okay, they know what they're doing, and this is probably how you fight a pandemic. So I was kind of just following orders and assuming that the state was controlling this pandemic. But later I started to be a little more interested in the Swedish approach. But still, then you could see the death toll rising in Sweden, where it was not rising in Denmark. And I was a little surprised that he could look at these data, which was basically the most important data we had at that point, and just still say this is the right way to do it. Because at that time, you didn't know that the curve was going to bend a few days later. It could have, at least to me, probably not to him, but at least to me, it was still possible that 87,000 would die in Sweden. So how do you stand up to that pressure? And I know there's been a debate in Sweden too. So can
I think if you compare to Denmark, there are a few differences. One is that there was one government agency that was in charge. As I've understood it from at least Norway and probably Denmark too, there were like a couple of competing government agencies that might have had different views on the topic. Mm-hmm. And the other is that the Swedish constitution grants a lot of independence to government agencies. It's almost like the courts in like a French or American system, where like it's even in the constitution that the government cannot interfere with certain kinds of government agency decisions. That doesn't mean that the government couldn't lock down if they wanted to, but they couldn't they didn't really have that, because for instance in the British system you have like I don't know if it's called chief medical officer or something like that, and you have like a surgeon general in the US, but you don't have like that scientific competence at the highest level of government. So all the people who know anything about epidemiology and those kinds of things are like in the government agency. So it's very difficult for the Swedish government to override its agencies.
Okay. Yeah, but that's the political side. I mean, on the human side, I would still say that. I mean, if he had just done like everybody else, and a lockdown, everybody would have said, okay, who knows? He did like everybody else, and that's fine. Yeah. So he took quite a large bet, doing something completely different compared to the rest of the Western world.
Yeah, and probably it helped that it happened over a few days and weeks, because if the entire world would have flipped like at once, maybe it would have been more difficult. But there were always some other countries that maybe would do like Sweden, and then they didn't.
So you mentioned that maybe you can talk a little about it. Where are we now when we count the death in Sweden compared to other countries?
Yeah, I mean, that's the really interesting part of this story, I think, because part of that bet, as you say, that's the Swedes did, was that eventually the rest of the world would catch up with Sweden. And I think they've been proved right, because at the peak, Sweden had the highest death toll per day for probably a week or two. And then more and more countries caught up. And in total, since the pandemic started, Sweden is now at number 54 in COVID deaths per capita. And if you measure excess mortality, Sweden is far down the bottom half of Europe.
Yeah, but that's compared to the rest of Europe. But if you compare to the other northern countries, then Sweden is.
Yeah.
So is it fair to compare Sweden to Italy and Spain? Isn't it more? Yeah, I have some clues on this, but wouldn't it be more fair to compare it to Denmark and Finland and Norway?
It's funny because that's like what the discussion in Sweden has boiled down to now, because everyone has acknowledged that a lot of countries have more deaths than Sweden. So the most stubborn like lockdown proponents, so to speak, they point to Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway. And I mean, I think there are probably like reasons to look at it both ways, but I would say that Sweden is kind of similar to Denmark, but not so similar to Norway and Finland, I'd say. When you look at our level of migration, and also like the way our economy is built, it's much more similar to Denmark than to Norway and Finland and Iceland, of course.
But you still have 3 times as many deaths as in Denmark compared to the population size.
3 times as many deaths as Norway, right?
That's right.
No,
I think that's right. I got the numbers here.
That Sweden exists.
3 times as many as Norway, and a little more than twice as many as Finland.
Okay, yeah. But what it's also funny because Swedes are like almost obsessed with like pointing out how Danes are different from Swedes. So it's kind of funny that now we're suddenly so similar. I don't know, what's your view on like the differences and similarities between Sweden?
I think a lot of I agree on what you. I don't think I mentioned this to you, but I totally agree that lockdowns don't work. At least not as well as they promised us. And I think the main reason for that is that I think there are 2 main reasons. First of all, people locked themselves down no matter what the government said. So. Yeah. For instance, it was still legal in Denmark to have guests in your house. You could have a birthday party if you wanted to, but people didn't do that because there was a pandemic and people was afraid. Yeah. So people were mimicking a lockdown no matter what the government said.
Yeah,
and also I think that let's what's your comment on that?
Yeah, especially in the beginning, I think, and that's like really interesting when it comes to how people behave, because you can see that trend in a lot of US states as well, that people locked down themselves before there was an official decree.
Yeah.
But then eventually, at least in Sweden, people, they took in the information and saw that this wasn't as deadly as it had been said in the first place. So they like adjusted their level of risk accordingly, I think.
Yeah, that was one of my topics for today's conversation, is that my view was that the communication from the Tegnell and what I remember the other guy, the former Gish or something like that.
Yeah,
they were out early and telling people that the infection fatality rate was probably very low for this disease, and there was reason to worry, but not to panic, basically.
Yeah.
And I think the way they communicated was a lot different from how communication was, at least in Denmark, and as I see as I perceive it in most of the world, so that where the Danish Prime Minister said that every death is a catastrophe, and so here in Denmark we really pushed to. I mean, the government and some of the agencies kind of created a kind of panic and told people that this was really, really dangerous. Where my perception was that in Sweden it was more, okay, here's a pandemic, but life must go on. So take care, but don't panic, basically. But what is your view on that?
Yeah, I think the Swedish approach acknowledges that there are a number of conflicts of interest here, that if you shut down schools, something else will happen. That's probably pretty bad for these kids.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And I thought it was kind of interesting to see how so many societies decided that there was just one data point that was interesting suddenly, which was number of deaths from COVID.
Yes.
And so someone told me, like, you could summarize the position that, like, no matter what it takes, we're going to reduce the number of deaths. It doesn't matter how many other deaths we create.
And what the costs are.
Yeah, but also you could measure the costs in deaths from like other problems or disease. Like for instance, some municipalities here in Sweden closed down the swimming pools for a couple of months. It's kind of weird because it was so late in the pandemic anyway, and so all the swimming schools for kids had to be shut down as well. And we know that I think it's about 100 people that drown every year in Sweden. So you can just do the math and see what happens if this generation doesn't learn how to swim. I mean, and then you can just add some other side effects from these kinds of weird lockdowns, and then you suddenly have as many deaths from all those things as you have from COVID.
Yeah, I don't know if that's we'll see how that turns out, but at least it's theoretically possible. But I totally agree on your point with that that society turned from having a lot of different goals that they want to follow and had to do trade-offs between should kids go to school or should they stay at home to protect their grandparents. But all of a sudden in Denmark, there was only one goal for the society, and that was to minimize the number of COVID deaths. And I don't think that's a healthy way to perceive, to run a society in basically.
Yeah.
But do you think that the average Swede was less afraid of COVID than the average Dane or the average European?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you could also notice that I mean, it wasn't forbidden to wear a face mask in Sweden, but almost no one did. And I think it's fair to say that face masks help to a certain degree. I don't know what the number was in that Bangladesh study, but we'll just say I think it was 9%, but I'll leave it for people to check themselves. But if you have something that you don't think is dangerous, those 9% don't matter. And you can definitely see in studies that have been made that people in a lot of countries have a very skewed view of how dangerous the virus is. Like, I think in Great Britain, a third of the population believe that as many people had died that actually live in the entire part of Great Britain, that is Wales. So they basically thought that many million people had died.
Yeah, and okay, so basically, I think you confirm my thesis that in Sweden the perception, maybe because Tegnell and Gish was talking about COVID as a not that dangerous disease, so and that probably affected that.
To be fair, they did underestimate.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. Yeah.
So, but I think they were a little bit closer to the truth than the alarmist side, so to speak.
Yeah, probably somewhere in between, right? the truth was in between.
Yeah,
but I agree. Yeah. So another thing another reason I don't think lockdowns work is because there's a lot of the things you can do to protect yourself that the state just basically can't regulate. I mean, how you if you cough in your sleeves, if you stay at home when you feel a little sick, if you use hand sanitizer and so on. So there's so many ways to be infected that the government can't really control because there's no way to enforce that people use hand sanitizer, for example. So I think when they did these models, they were focusing too much on, I mean, this modeling where they said that 87,000, was it 87?
That's actually interesting because some Swedish researchers who used the imperial model said 96,000, But then after a couple of weeks, when Imperial College realized that many Swedes wouldn't die, they said that they had never ever made a prediction for Sweden. But then I think it was the Spectator that found some kind of prediction for Sweden, and that said 84,700 in a couple of months' time.
So 85,000. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I lost my. But anyway, I think it's really difficult to regulate if people cover their arms, wash their hands, and so on. And if you only look at contacts and how many people meet, then you miss a very important point: is that people can meet without being dangerous to each other because they can protect themselves from the disease, even though they are in the same room or in the same building.
Yeah, and also I think. So, like sometimes people's incentives, like individual incentives, might be bad for society, like with pollution and stuff like that. But when it comes to health, everyone has a pretty strong incentive to guard their own health. So, if you just tell them that there's a fairly dangerous virus spreading, I think most people will take the precautions that are useful to them.
Du lytter til Regelstaten.
Okay, so we talked a little about that Sweden had a higher death tolls than the other northern countries, Scandinavian countries. And I don't know if you know this, but there's been two studies from one study from Copenhagen, University of Copenhagen, and one study from the University of Lund, where they look at what the winter holiday. The impact of winter holiday and the timing of winter holidays on the spread of COVID. Are you familiar with those studies?
Yeah. There is an ongoing debate right now that whether or not the community spread was wide already, like when the lockdowns happened in and that we had much more contagion already compared to Denmark and Norway.
Yeah, exactly. That's if you look at the death tolls, then you can see that. I mean, if lockdown works, then from lockdown to we can see it in the death numbers. It will take approximately 3 weeks because it takes 3 to 4 weeks from infection to you die until you die. But 3 weeks after we locked down in Denmark, Sweden was just way ahead of us in death tolls. So for some reason, Denmark was not as hard hit to begin with as Sweden was. And these scientists, they think that it's a part of the reason is because of the winter holiday, that when people from Stockholm had sports law, as it's called in Sweden, that was in week 9, where there was a big breakout in the Alps.
Yeah.
So they got down there, but people didn't know there was a outbreak down there. So people went on ski holiday and came home and then went back to work. And a lot of them was probably infected and spread it to their colleagues and family and so on. This late compared to Denmark, where it was in most of Denmark has holiday in week 7. And that was before there was an outbreak in the Alps. So because of this, the scientists basically, they show that week 9 was the worst week to have a winter holiday because there was an outbreak, but we didn't know. So people who went down there got infected and got home without knowing that they had been in a dangerous place, and then spread it to the rest of society. And as far as I remember, it accounts for about 1/3 of the extra cases. So it's a pretty large effect, for just basically coincidence.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of interesting to see the modeling that was made like before this, and for people like when it started in Wuhan in China, because then the models show that Australia would be really hard hit because there were a lot of like international flights between China and Australia, and then suddenly like northern Italy gets hit first. So it's I think these are like answers we probably never will get fully, but it's true that the week 9 is a major holiday week in Stockholm.
Yeah.
And southern Sweden is week 8, which wasn't as badly hit. I mean, yeah, it's super interesting, but I'm not sure we'll ever like find out.
Know the full truth.
Yeah.
No, but it's in. I mean, it's fairly or maybe it's controversial to say it, but at least when you look at the data, it's uncontroversial to say that more immigrants have been hit by COVID for various reasons. One of my friends is Turkish, and I mean the way they meet with their family is just way different than the way we do in my family. The Danish families do. Like they're much closer connected in some way and spend a lot more time together with their families. So that might be one of the reasons. They also have different kind of jobs. But anyway, if you have more immigrants in a country, then
the poverty situation in Sweden is really bad among some of these groups. So they live on they have really small cramped apartments, stuff like that. So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there's many good, what do you call it, like good reasons for this to happen. But it's just like if you have more immigrants, then you'll also have more cases. And then Sweden has an older population and a different kind of. So I think if you add all these things together, maybe someday in the future you can say, like you can kind of divide it up and say the reason Sweden was harder hit was because of A, B, and C. And if you take away these reasons, you'll have more or less similar.
But in the end, I think a more interesting question is like we could just like assume that if we just assume that Sweden could have had the Danish death toll per capita. I don't. Like,
was it worth it?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at how we viewed society a couple of years ago, I think if we hadn't had this power, we would have been able to talk about this. Like, what other values do we have in society? How important is it for people to get educated, for kids to be in school, for kids to play sports with their friends, to meet their friends? And I mean, even now in Sweden, there's this discussion like Sweden versus Denmark, Sweden versus Norway. But actually, Denmark is like way more free than some other parts of the world as well. I find it interesting that kids in the US wear face masks in school still.
And 40, I think it was 40 states, they implemented shelter in place orders, so people couldn't leave their homes. So it was really tough. Yeah,
and I remember reading all these articles about how certain states, certain countries had beaten COVID. And it was like Uruguay had beaten COVID.
Eastern Europe
had beaten COVID. Minnesota, I think, it was a big story in Business Week. And now when you look at the death tolls in those, they're like about Sweden's. I think there are like 44 or 43 states that have a higher death toll per capita than Sweden. I mean, it's so incredibly complex.
Can we talk a little more about the values and the trade-offs? Because you wrote an op-ed in Sydsvenskan. Yeah. I can link to it in the show notes.
It's in English as well, unheard. So you can do the English thing, maybe. Or maybe it's for Danish people. So
yeah. Oh yeah, and we forgot to mention that your book will also be available in English soon. Yeah. But anyway, it's about the COVID policies and situation in Sweden. But you start by talking about what is called the alcohol ban in the US in the 30s. Yeah, prohibition. Yeah. So can talk a little. What is your point with that?
Well, it's that in the 20s, people, America, as did Sweden, as did Denmark, had this big public health problem, which was alcohol. Still a huge public health problem. So they just decided to ban it. And I mean, on the outset, it looks pretty reasonable. Like you have this threat, and if you just ban it, the problems will disappear. But societies proved to be more complex than people thought, and you got all these like side effects, and people didn't stop drinking anyway. And So the initial discussion whether or not alcohol was dangerous or not was like not the point when they abolished prohibition. Like the reason why you can't have prohibition in a democratic country is that it doesn't work. That's like, and it's kind of the same thing with other public health issues. I think that you can like ban drugs and have like really hard drug laws, but in the end, people still consume drugs, and like the way to make people use less drugs is to keep them like healthy, educated, and informed. And it's not really a matter of like, is this dangerous or not? It's like, does it work or not?
Yeah, I understand. And also even if alcohol consumption dropped by some factor, then there was still a lot of extra other costs. So it would always end out to be a trade-off.
I think the total consumption actually did decrease. It was not like a complete failure, but almost a complete failure. In the op-ed, you also, I think it was in the op-ed, you also talk about how Sweden disappeared from the international media. Like back in early 2020, Sweden was all over the place. All major newspapers wrote about Anders Tegnell and Sweden and so on. And then, but today nobody cares. Can you talk a little about your viewpoint on that? Yeah, as I see it, international media, and in particular, Anglo-Saxon center-left media had this like urge to show Sweden as like a cautionary tale. That was even the headline of one of the New York Times articles, and Sweden was called the pariah state by the New York Times as well. And now Sweden has a lower death toll than the US, even though they took one path and we took another. And of course, there are like a number of reasons why Sweden has turned out better than people, but I think it would have been fair to like revisit the hypothesis and see that it turned out much better than they thought. And then they should, maybe they should acknowledge that like the complexity a little bit more. But still, it's very binary in American media in particular. I think that you have to do this, otherwise you're unscientific. But the science is much more complicated than.
So then, why do you think this is? Like, why do you think that Sweden disappeared like that?
I think they took a bet that it would go really bad, and now it's a little bit difficult to come back and revisit it. I think it's difficult also to have been like, especially if you're a journalist and maybe come from like a liberal tradition, and as I do, like as a journalist, you learn how to value people's freedoms because like our entire trade is based on freedom. And then I think it's very difficult to acknowledge to yourself that you've been complicit in a lockdown strategy that has been detrimental to people's freedoms, people's lives, and also hasn't proven very effective.
I see what you mean, but maybe it's also just because it's more fun to read about odd things or catastrophes or something like that. So yeah, and everybody thought that Sweden was heading for a catastrophe, or at least what was told that Sweden was heading for a catastrophe. So that was interesting, like watching a plane crash in slow motion or something, and then it turned out that the plane didn't crash, and who wants to read a story about that?
I never believe in conspiracies, so I don't think it's a conspiracy at all. I just think we call in Sweden, we talk about cognitive dissonance a lot. And it is very hard to change your mind about something, especially if you've been on the record saying something. It's incredibly difficult to change your mind.
But I think also, but maybe that's Maybe it's more the media reader that suffers from cognitive dissonance, and not as much the journalist, because maybe you know this better than me, but I think the journalist will basically write anything that provides readers for the newspapers.
Yeah, to a certain extent, it is like that. I agree.
So if you write 3 articles about Sweden and how it turned out to work pretty well, but nobody reads it, then I find it's pretty natural to turn your focus on something else.
Yeah, you're right, because the New Yorker actually had a fairly honest article about it, and it was kind of boring to read, actually. So you probably.
And I think one of the problems is that the story is out there, and I think if you ask random people around the world, people will think that Sweden was a catastrophe because they haven't checked the data on Sweden, and they just remember they read something about Sweden in the beginning of the pandemic, and so that's basically what.
Yeah.
What that's their knowledge at this point in time, that Sweden did something wrong and was a failure, and it was because the state didn't control the pandemic.
Yeah, and I don't mind if people have like an incorrect view of Sweden. I mean, you come from a small country too, and like people have like all kinds of weird ideas about what our countries are like. But I think it's sad that they think that the state managed to handle the pandemic and that they devalue people's choices and people's freedoms, and it's hard to understand for people that freedom is also a strategy. That if you trust people to make the right decisions, most people will make the right decisions.
Yeah, that's probably the major point that I'm still interested in this lockdown discussion, is that I fear that it will affect other policies, basically. Because of course I don't think lockdown worked, at least not that well, in reducing the number of COVID deaths. But if people think that lockdown worked, like if the state from Christiansborg in Denmark and Stockholm in Sweden, if they can handle a complex thing like the pandemic, where everything is so complex because you can get infected and infect other people in so many circumstances and ways, and if that can be controlled by a central planner, then there's no reason why a central planner can't handle drinking, smoking, and where you should live and who you should marry. And I mean, you can spread it out to almost all decisions in life. So that's why.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that in Sweden, like the political scale was reversed, because we have a social democratic government now, and so after a little bit of bickering in the beginning, like the right-wing parties were like more in favor of harsh measures, and a lot of the newspapers were very anti-Tegnell as well. So I talked to one conservative writer who was like really critical of the Swedish strategy. But then I told him, like, I mean, you don't even have your kids in preschool because you don't trust the government. I mean, you don't trust the government to take care of all these like millions of things that like a lockdown entails.
And what was his response?
I mean, to be honest, to be fair, he was kind of like open to new suggestions, but I think one reason why right-wing people in Sweden didn't like the Swedish strategy was that it was based on this Swedish equality, this almost social democratic view that. For instance, Anders Tegnell said once that if you shut down society, it will disadvantage some people, which is true, because like if you live in a crammed apartment, a lockdown is much worse than if you live in a suburb where you have like a garden and maybe a swimming pool.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the way that it was framed was that it was like a public health thing. So it was seen as kind of like a half socialist thing to make everyone, like to make all society work as it did like before the pandemic.
Or maybe they just were in opposition to the government and said something different than the government.
Yeah. And I think, to be honest, I think that is one of the reasons why so much of American media was pro-lockdown, was because the Trump administration was more on the open side, even though they were kind of harsh as well.
And I think that's a major misconception of what happened in the US, was that people thought that this was something Trump could do something about. But it was, I mean, their system is just that this is a state problem. Yeah. And the states was, so I think in the beginning, and maybe also now, a lot of people think that the US didn't shut down because Trump said that it was rubbish. But in fact, all states did lock down. And most of them really tough lockdowns. So, so my last question is, what do you think people will take with them from this pandemic, and what has happened the last 2 years, and what do you think they should take with them, and how do these two things differ?
I think what they should take with them is that you should trust people to make the right decisions, and that it's very hard to like central plan things like this. And right now, I think they think of it as something that the government should have done more in almost every country. But I don't know. There was like an author who said about the tulip bubble in Holland that people go insane together, but they regain their mind one by one. And I can really feel people getting their act together like one by one. I mean, there are so many people who have gotten in touch with me who said they can't change their mind about the pandemic strategies after reading my book. And I can see it like when people are writing that they're not as harsh anymore. And I can see it in some other writers internationally as well. So I think we'll slowly like get out of this hole we've dug.
And what do you think we will learn? Will we arrive in a better society, or in something worse compared to the situation before the pandemic?
I mean, I always answer better. Like you could have asked me like anything, and I would be better. Like, but
okay. So why do you think that?
Because as long as like information is free and that people can like read and see for themselves how things have played out, I think people will see what has happened and what has worked and what hasn't worked. But I have to say that it has been kind of a somewhat dark time for like free thought, free press, and stuff like that. So it's I've been very like disappointed with a lot of like writers and intellectuals that I used to like. I still like them, but I think they were completely wrong about the pandemic.
Yeah, I got the same feeling, and I was kind of pessimistic until I read a piece about England after the Second World War, where they saw that the state could do so much good because they beat the Germans, and now they wanted to do like fix all other problems in the society. But when they tried, they found out that people didn't want that. People want them to fix like a major threat, like for instance the Germans, and maybe the COVID pandemic. But afterwards they found out that this at least in England after the Second World War, they found out that like the state's solution to a war might be good, but it's not good at fixing and finding out what I should buy for my own money and so on. So I hope that we'll see the same after this pandemic.
I like, for the record, I do think the government could be the solution in maybe a few more things than you, but there is a limit, and the government definitely crossed that threshold.
Okay, I totally agree on that. Like there's a for instance, there's a big information problem.
Yeah,
like if somebody in February 2020 told me that you have to protect yourself against a pandemic, but didn't tell me what to do, I would be a little confused, because I mean, there's so much stuff that you know today that I didn't know back then about how virus spread and what you can do to protect yourself against it. So I think clearly that the government has an information, some information problems they can solve just in preparing people how to protect themselves against the pandemic.
Yeah, but I also have to say that, like, we focus so much on what we can do to